Hi, everyone, and welcome to GRUFFtalk, where each week we take a deep dive into all the ways we can feel better, look better, live better, and age better. Before we dive in, just a quick reminder that you can subscribe to GRUFFtalk wherever you listen to podcasts, including right on my own website, barbarahannahgrufferman.com. And if you have questions for me or suggestions for topics you want to see talked about on the show, email me at grufftalkpodcast@gmail.com. I'm your host, Barbara Hannah Grufferman. I'm going to make this episode introduction very, very short because the discussion I had with my guest is, well, a bit long. So best if you grab a nice cup of tea or a glass of wine, put your feet up, close your eyes, and learn about how your gut microbiome is hard at work to help you age better. As my guest today will tell you, it's like having a rainforest in your gut. It's a complex community of bacteria and other bugs that break down food and churn out chemicals to keep literally every inch of your body functioning and healthy. And most importantly for us, new research shows that a diverse gut microbiome has been linked to a longer, healthier life. Today, you'll hear from one of the lead researchers involved in this groundbreaking study and what it means to you and your long-term health, wellness, and longevity. Sean Gibbons earned his PhD in biophysics from the University of Chicago and continued his postdoctoral work at MIT. Dr. Gibbons is now an assistant professor at the Institute for Systems Biology in Seattle. His lab, the Gibbons Lab, studies the ecology and evolution of microbiome communities, and he's particularly interested in how these communities influence health and disease. Ultimately, the Gibbons Lab aims to develop strategies for manipulating the gut microbiome to improve human health. Some really fun facts about our guest today. Dr. Gibbons was raised in Montana, and his father, Mark Gibbons, is Montana's poet laureate. I was super excited to have this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Let's go. So hello, Dr. Gibbons, and welcome to GRUFFtalk.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about. But before we dive in, I have to ask you something I like to ask a lot of my guests. And since we're talking today about the gut microbiome, and you are a gut microbiome expert, everyone is going to want to know, as do I, what did you have for breakfast today?
It's a good question. I'm not a huge breakfast guy. I don't usually eat breakfast, honestly. Although this morning I did have something. I had kefir with some blueberries and then a cup of coffee.
Oh, that's
nothing too exciting.
No, but actually really good. Okay, you get kudos for that. Okay, I was thinking, oh no, is he going to say like a croissant with lots of butter? But no, okay, you get a gold star today.
I practice what I preach.
Okay, and people have heard already, like, it's so boring now what I eat. I eat the same thing every single morning, and I think it's really good. It's like a multi-grain toast with very good quality peanut butter, with some blueberries and chia seeds. So that's good, right? Yes. Hopefully you're going to give me a gold star. Okay, so Dr. Gibbons, when we scheduled this discussion, I immediately posted on social media letting people know about it. And then I invited everyone to post their questions about gut health. And we got some really good questions. And I have quite a few of my own too. But before we get into those specific questions, let's do a short masterclass on the gut microbiome. Starting with, okay, here it is. What are microbiomes? And specifically, what is the gut microbiome? And why is it so important that we know about this?
Yeah, so biome is an ecological term. So it's just a term that describes the sort of environment in which organisms reside. So the desert is a kind of biome, right? Or a rainforest is a kind of biome. Micro means small. So the microbiome is just a very small ecosystem. And the human microbiome is the ecosystem of our body and all the microorganisms that reside within it. There's some technical differences with how we call things in my field, So the microbiome is often used as a catch-all term to describe all the genes that are in the microbes of our bodies, whereas the microbiota are the actual organisms themselves, the cells and the actual living creatures. And so when we study the microbiome,
excuse me,
go ahead.
sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but it's my understanding that there are trillions and trillions and trillions of these little things on every surface of our body, inside and out. Is this true?
That is true. We are a donut, topologically speaking. So the outside of our bodies includes our skin and our gut because it's all exposed to the outside. And on that surface, there's something like 30, 40, 50 trillion bacterial cells, which is about on par with the number of human cells in our bodies, which is about 30 trillion. So maybe there's a few more microbes than human cells in and on our bodies. And then if you look in the genes, the genetic component of those cells, from the microbe side, there's something like several million genes. And in our own genome, there's only about 20,000 genes. So there's 100 times at least more genes in our microbiome than in our genome.
So there's a microbiome really on every surface of our body, inside and out. But what about specifically the gut microbiome? What can you tell us about that? And why is it so important that we know about it?
Yeah, the gut is where most of the microbes on our bodies reside. The vast majority, say by 99% probably, of all the cells in and on our bodies reside within the colon, the lower part of the gastrointestinal tract. And the gut is just a big anaerobic fermenter, a bioreactor. We push a bunch of food through the system, and we do our best to extract nutrition from it in our stomachs and in our small intestine. So we do whatever we can do with our genes and our enzymes to get nutrition out of that food. And what's left over gets dumped into the colon, and that's where we allow the microbes to do whatever they want to do with that material. And they can ferment it, break it down, and we actually derive additional nutrition from our diets that we wouldn't normally have access to through the activity of these microbes in the colon.
What's so interesting to me is that I know that this has been a topic of interest in the scientific community, of course, but then among the general population, like myself, really just recently. And it's because we just didn't know a lot about the gut microbiome until recently. So let's segue right into the research that you did for a number of years. And then it came out last year, about a year ago. I believe you and your team at the Gibbons, yes, he has his own lab at the Institute for Systems Biology, or ISB, and with support from some other leading research organizations. But they came out with some pretty astonishing new information about the gut microbiome and aging, right? And it really got a lot of attention, of course, in the scientific community, but it was also extensively covered in the general media. In fact, the first time I saw this study was in the New York Times. And why is that? It's because it was so surprising. And that research has really changed how we look at gut health and its relationship to healthy aging, or unhealthy aging for that matter. So please, Dr. Gibbons, talk us through the highlights of this research and then some of the key implications for all of us and for how we can age better.
Yeah, so in this particular study, we wanted to address a question of, are there different signatures in the gut for people who are aging healthily and people who are aging less healthily? Prior work in the field up to that point was simply looking at the association between age and the microbiome and not really considering the health state of the host, of the person. So there were divergent results out there. We saw that in centenarians, there was certain kinds of patterns that you saw, like a reduction in core microbes that tend to be shared across people. We tended to see this in centenarian populations around the world. But then we looked at other elderly populations who were maybe in assisted living facilities, we didn't see this in the literature. And so it looked like there were these disagreeable or inconsistent results across studies. So what we wanted to do is grab a big population of people, have a lot of data on their underlying health state, and be able to segregate the population along the lines of health. And so we did this, and we looked at the relationship between various parameters of the ecology of the gut and age, And we saw very distinct signatures for those who were aging healthily and for those who were aging less healthily.
So it was a combination, you're saying, of having like what you called a core microbiome, and that's kind of shared among most people, if not all people, but then things start to diverge. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so it's a little complicated to explain. It's a little esoteric, but I think I can try to do it quickly here. So if you compare any two human beings and look at the number of species they share across their microbiomes, it's something like 20 to 30%. So most of the microbes that they have are unique to them. And if you then compare three people and ask what are the bugs that are conserved across all three, it drops to like less than 10%.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are actually very few organisms that are ubiquitously shared across all humans, maybe even none. But there are a subset that tend to be found across, say, 90% of all people. And these are what we call core microbes.
Okay.
One particular group of core microbes that we identified, it's common in America and in Europe, as the genus Bacteroides. And so this was the biggest signature we saw in our data set. This core genus, with age, it seems to decline in those who are aging healthily. And as it declines, all the other taxa that make us more unique, they rise in prevalence relative to that other declining core taxon. And so we calculated something called a uniqueness score, which is essentially how different people are from one another in their microbiomes. And this uniqueness score was increasing more and more and more as people got older and older and older. People were drifting apart, becoming more unique as they got older.
And that was a good thing, you're saying, that
yes,
was a positive.
Only in the healthy people.
Mm-hmm,
right? This wasn't occurring in people that were showing a less than healthy signature. But in the healthy folks, they did show this drift.
That's really fascinating. So, very often we think, we want to maintain certain aspects of our health and our body as we get older from what it was in our 20s and 30s, like bone density or muscle mass, et cetera. But in this case, we really want to see change. We want to see divergence and uniqueness.
I think so, although, we're the first to sort of show this pattern. And so I look forward to other groups replicating our results. Also, I would have to caveat what we did in that we only looked at elderly people up to about 100 years old, 99 or so. Supercentenarians are a group that's hard to capture in studies because they're so rare, people who are 120 years old, for example.
Sure.
So what I don't know is whether this pattern persists out through that really, really extended lifespan. But yes, this seemed to be the case. We found that people that showed this increasing uniqueness score, they were more likely to survive in the latest decades of life. So we were able to do a statistical analysis with a 4-year follow-up study and ask people who had this drift signature, if you looked 4 years in the future, did they tend to survive versus those who didn't? And those who had the drift were more likely to survive to follow up.
And I'm curious about, you used the term survive, but did they thrive? Meaning, were they less inclined? I guess the assumption is yes, that less inclined to succumb to some of the more common diseases and illnesses of, older years.
Yeah, so that survival analysis was literally survival, right? So we had information on whether people lived or died over a 4-year window. And so that was specifically survival. But the way in which we split our population on health lines was to have multiple metrics of health. Mm-hmm. So one of them was walking speed. So the faster you can walk when you're very elderly is very correlated with your overall health and strength and lack of frailty.
Mm-hmm. I've seen other studies about that as well. Mm-hmm.
Number of medications that you were on is also associated with health. And then there were other metrics called the life space score, which is a metric of how often you get around. How often do you get out of your house, out of your neighborhood? How mobile are you in your life? And then we had an aggregate metric where you had to be healthy according to several of our other metrics in order to be considered very healthy. And so that's how indeed, those who were suffering from fewer diseases, taking fewer medications, and had less frailty, they were the ones that were showing this uniqueness, this drift.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the big question, and we'll get more into kind of the granular stuff, in a few minutes with the questions. But then, you do wonder, is this true because their gut health was so much better and divergent and unique and all the other words that unique signatures that you used? Or, was it the chicken or the egg, right? Or was it
Right.
because were just living a more healthy life, perhaps throughout their lives? But we'll get more into that. Before we start to go into the questions, I want to keep with our masterclass for a minute and shift gears a little bit, but stay connected. Let's talk about inflammation, because I know from many studies and research that I've done personally that inflammation is really important to healthy aging and to just actually for all ages to living a healthy life and health and wellness. So what is the connection of inflammation to the gut microbiome?
The connection is huge. There's widespread interactions between our microbiota and our immune system. This actually links very well to this uniqueness story. We looked at metabolites in the bloodstream that were associated with this drift, and many of them that popped up were microbially derived metabolites. For example, we saw fermentation byproducts of the amino acid tryptophan that are called indoles that are produced by our microbiome that are absorbed into the blood. And these have been shown in mouse studies to reduce inflammation, systemic inflammation, to increase intestinal integrity, reduce leakiness, and extend lifespan and health span. So even though, like you said, we don't know whether we see correlation or causation with this aging study because we were looking at an observational cohort, we see that this uniqueness drift score is associated with metabolites that have been validated in other contexts and animal studies to be causally associated with lifespan and health span. So that's one element, one axis through which the microbes seem to be affecting the immune system. But there are many. For example, short chain fatty acid production. Right? Mm-hmm. Microbes produce things like acetate, butyrate, propionate. These are organic acids that are the end products of fermentation. So the main thing that microbes are doing in the gut is they're taking fibers and they're breaking them down and fermenting those sugars into acids. And our bodies absorb these acids. And acids like butyrate are incredibly strongly implicated in inflammation. It's well understood that higher levels of butyrate lead to lower levels of local peripheral inflammation in the gut, but also even lower systemic inflammation. There's different T cells that live, which are immune cells that live in the intestinal epithelium. There's two types, major types. One are Tregs, which tamp down inflammation, and the other are Th17 cells, which kind of turn up inflammation. And butyrate tips the balance towards the Tregs, so it kind of turns down your immune system, makes it less excited, less likely to react to stimuli. So the microbiome can really modulate your inflammation state, not only towards anti-inflammation, but also pro-inflammation, right? Certain organisms can actually turn up your inflammatory state. And I'll quickly mention that, we might want to do both, right? If the microbiome can be this tool we can use, we can leverage to modify the host's immune system. And sometimes we want to turn down inflammation in the case of things like autoimmune disease. We want to turn down those responses. But in the case of cancer, for example, there are these new types of therapies called immunotherapies, where we harness the immune system to attack and kill the cancer. In those cases, it seems that microbiomes that are pro-inflammatory actually help with the efficacy of those cancer treatments. So in that case, you might want to turn up inflammation. And so the microbiome provides us a way to do that.
It's a manipulation of the microbiome, right? That's the goal?
Exactly. There are clinical trials where they've used fecal transplants, which you take poop from one person and put them into another, to change the outcome of cancer immunotherapy. You can turn non-responders to cancer immunotherapies to responders with an FMT that, as far as we can see, turn up the inflammation state of the recipient.
That's really incredible. I've been reading a lot about that for a number of years. But my understanding too is it's a temporary measure. Like you can't expect to have a fecal transplant. Am I right about that? Can you talk about that? Is that something that can affect the gut microbiome on a more permanent basis? Or is it really more for temporary measures like what you just described with the cancer treatment?
It's a good question. The major use of fecal transplants currently are for the treatment of recurrent Clostridioides difficile or C. diff infections.
Yeah.
The FDA has provided emergency use authorization for using FMTs for that particular application. And in the short term, it cures C. diff infections. So we know this to be true. There are studies that look at what's called engraftment, which is, of the bugs that were in the donor's transplant material, how many of them stick around for the long term in the recipient? And many of them do stick around for months, even years. We don't have really long-term data from FMT trials just because they've only been studied for the past decade or so.
Right.
So whether or not the bugs you get from your donor stick around for your whole life, we don't know the answer to that question.
But it's being followed.
It's being
currently.
Followed, and it can have long-lasting effects for sure.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that. Really fascinating. After this short break, everyone, will get to your questions, including, a few that I have also. And so stay tuned. Okay, we're back with Dr. Sean Gibbons, a leading expert on the gut microbiome from the Institute of Systems Biology in Seattle. Now that we've gotten a solid understanding of what the gut microbiome is from the little masterclass we just had and how it can affect how we age, let's get to some of the specific questions GRUFFtalk listeners sent in, starting with this one from a listener who wants to encourage her own daughters to think more about their guts. Her daughters happen to be like mine in their 20s, and she wants them to kind of be thinking about all of these things now. So, Dr. Gibbons, are there things that we can do throughout our lifetimes to manipulate, as we said before, our microbiomes to make sure that our microbiomes will be more unique and diversified, using your terms, when we get older, which is a good thing, which we now understand is critical to successful aging? What do you say to that?
There are definitely things that you could do. The best thing that anyone can do for the health and wellness of their microbial ecosystem is to eat a really diverse array of fruits and vegetables, more dietary fiber, having a really sort of diverse intake, eat the rainbow, people often say, right? Get your reds and your yellows and your greens. The more plants you eat, the more fiber you eat from a variety of plant sources, the more diverse your microbiome generally will be. That's been held up by many, many, many studies.
We're going to get into more specific questions about what to eat, what not to eat in a second. But here's a super important question for a lot of people tuning in right now, including me. In fact, let's use me as an example, shall we? Before turning 50, I was cruising through life, working really hard, raising a family, trying to be a good partner to my equally hardworking husband. And I really didn't think twice about my health and wellness at that time. I just really wasn't doing much of anything. It all took a backseat. So when I hit 50, when I had my aha moment, and I reassessed and revamped everything, and everyone who knows my backstory knows this to be true. So here's the question. Can you positively change your gut microbiome later in life, like let's say 50, which was when I had my moment, by taking all of these measures, as including what you just suggested we all eat? Or are you stuck with what you have?
Great question. Generally speaking, I think this has been borne out by epidemiology, nutrition, and any other fields research over the past several decades. The best thing you can do for your health as you age is just exercise and eat a diverse diet that includes a lot of plants. If you do those two things, your long-term risk for all of these chronic conditions, including heart disease, diabetes, what have you, declines as you age.
Are there studies that show that because who knows what my gut microbiome was at the age of 50 when I turned everything around? Who knows? I have no idea. I mean, I wasn't feeling great. I feel much better now that I've taken all these measures. But you know what I'm saying is like, did I really make a change in my gut microbiome by making these healthy lifestyle changes, in your opinion? Do you think?
Yeah, well, so yes, you can definitely budge your microbiome through altering your diet and lifestyle. Just to give you a quick overview of how the dynamics of the microbiome go throughout life, it's very turbulent and dynamic in early life, the first few months to years. There's a huge amount of turnover. It stabilizes at about 2 or 3 years of life, and it looks kind of adult. At that point, it's pretty stable on month to year timescales, as long as you aren't making radical changes to your diet or taking a bunch of antibiotics or have some sort of disease. The abundances of all the organisms remain pretty static and stable on the month to year timescale. But there is a slow drift where you do see changes happening on sort of decadal timescales, and the slow change that occurs with kind of late stage adult aging. But on that background, you can also make radical shifts. So if you switched your entire diet, if you're eating sort of the standard American diet, and you switched to a Mediterranean diet and persisted in that diet over time, your microbiome is going to look very different across that switch.
Great.
It's just hard for people to change their habits. But if you do change your habits, you can change your microbiome.
I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, that's what the last episode of GRUFFtalk was focused on, how to kind of stick with those new healthy habits you want to do. But that's what I wanted to know. So thank you for that answer. Okay, so some listener questions. Dr. Gibbons, do you recommend taking probiotic supplements, or is that all best coming from food?
That is a complicated question. I'll try to go quickly in my answer. Basically, the current slate of probiotic organisms that are on the market are things that are already present in food, like cheese or sauerkraut. And so the FDA has approved them as safe. They're on a list that's called GRAS, or generally regarded as safe. So companies can legally market these things and give them to people as essentially food. It's considered a food additive. Now, that market is not very well regulated. And so I remember in my PhD, my PhD advisor went to the market and grabbed a bunch of different probiotics and then sequenced the bugs that were in them. And only about half of them were what they were on the label, right? So I think part of it is it's a regulatory issue if you don't quite know what you're getting. Another part of it is there are clinical trials that show efficacy of certain probiotics for particular uses, like, say, preventing diarrhea. But the strain level annotation of those probiotics is super important. So maybe it's Bifidobacterium adolescentis, but there are many strains of that organism, and different strains can have different effects. So you have to be sure you're taking the same strain that was studied in the trial to be sure that the effect is going to be comparable. Overall, most existing probiotics, the biggest thing that seems to be affected by them is mild diarrhea. So there are several that seem to help alleviate mild cases of diarrhea. Beyond that, there's what's called next generation probiotics. And this is what I'm more excited about, because these are bugs that are actually abundant taxa in the human adult gut. The current ones that are on the market are abundant in babies for the most part, like Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus. But things like strict anaerobes that live in the adult gut, like Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes, these are not yet approved for human use. And so they have to be pushed through clinical trials. And that is currently happening. And there's a few that have been approved for human use. One that I'm excited about right now is called Akkermansia muciniphila. This is a bug that specializes in eating our mucus. And there's a company now that sells it, and you can buy it. I think it's Pendulum is the name of the company. They had a clinical trial 2 years ago, I believe, that was very exciting, where they showed that providing this probiotic to people could improve symptoms of prediabetes and sort of overall metabolic health. And I think that once we can get a bigger list of these truly abundant gut bugs on our list of available probiotics to give to people, that's where probiotics are going to start to have a much stronger effect on human health.
So you did say that one of these, and I will get that information, everyone, and it'll be in the show notes. But you said there is one that is currently available, but it sounds like there will be more options down the road. What do you think the time frame is for all of this, given the clinical studies that are going on about it? What do you think?
I know there are many phase 1 trials happening with some of these organisms. Like I said, Akkermansia is already available. I think there's a company in Europe called the Akkermansia Company that sells Akkermansia, and then Pendulum in the US are now selling it. There's another bug that's a butyrate producer. I talked about butyrate earlier as being anti-inflammatory.
Yes.
This bug is named Fecalibacterium prausnitzii, or F-Prau. It's very abundant in many people, but in people who lack it, they often can have trouble. Like you often see it lacking in people who have inflammatory bowel disease. That bug is currently in phase 1 trials to prove safety. And if it passes, then it might someday be available. And I think that's true for a few dozen, probably, of these next generation probiotics that in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to see emerging into the market.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, so you did cover a bit about some of the best foods, certainly vegetables, the rainbow, fruits. What are the best foods to help create the ideal gut microbiome? This is directly from a listener. And which foods should we absolutely avoid? And Dr. Gibbons, some of the research I've seen recently on all of this made a very strong case that a plant-based diet with lots of fiber, which you also mentioned, is the golden ticket to a healthy gut microbiome. So does this mean, even if we kind of go in that direction, not completely vegan or completely plant-based, but really go in that direction, like a Mediterranean diet, for example, but does that mean that if we have the occasional ribeye steak and French fries, we're doomed?
That's a great question. I don't think so. No, I think that being an omnivore is okay as long as the vast majority of your diet is plant-based. It's fine to eat meat, but I think just eating very much less of it. I try to eat meat maybe once or twice a week. Just eat less of it and you're going to be fine.
Oh, it's good to know that you eat meat. Okay. I was going to get to that eventually. Like, are you completely plant-based or, okay, so you're not. You eat a little of everything, it sounds like.
I do. But to get a little into that question, because it's a really good question, there are great population scale interventions for diet. Like the Mediterranean diet has been widely studied, and it's generally shown to be very good for most people. So if you switch to a Mediterranean diet, chances are you're going to be feeling better probably than you do now. However, there is really recent emerging research showing that personalized diets may be what the future will hold for us. There's a group in Israel, around Segal's lab, where they had a paper a few years ago showing that they could predict the post-meal glucose spike response of individuals to specific foods, right? If you feed 10 people a banana, they're all going to have really different responses to that same exact food. Some of them have a really almost pre-diabetic looking glucose spike, and some of them have a really healthy little blip. And it seems like we can predict this kind of response based on your microbiome composition. So I know Segal has now created a company called Day 2, which is targeting people with prediabetes and diabetes. They had a clinical trial this last year showing that their personalized dietary predictions were actually better at mitigating these glucose spikes than the standard Mediterranean diet. They did a head-to-head comparison. Some of the critiques of these personalized interventions so far are that, the personalized diets that are different from the Mediterranean diets are just looking kind of more and more plant-based, which is something a nutritionist maybe could have told you already, right? It's just eat even more plants, eat even more healthy stuff than the Mediterranean diet would even have you do. But at least these precision intervention algorithms can start pointing towards people that might need even a more radical dietary intervention than others. Now, the big question that my lab is kind of working on that I think is exciting is, can we really say that person A should eat a banana and person B should eat a tangerine, and that those are optimal interventions for those people? Like specific foods, if we swap them for different people, say plant-based fibers, do they have differential effects, and can we choose rationally between those things? And I think that's possible, but the research is still ongoing. So I think personalized and precision diets will become something important for healthcare in the future.
And that was one of the questions that we had from a listener. And that is so fascinating to me, and I think to all of us. And also what's so incredible to me once I started digging deeper into the whole gut microbiome in preparation for this chat and listening to you on YouTube and the like, there's something quite mind-blowing that there are 8 billion people on the planet. And this is what I've learned. No two people have the same gut microbiome. So we each have a completely unique gut microbiome. So therefore, as you were just saying, that kind of that one size fits all approach to eating and nutrition really sounds obsolete, to pull a favorite word from Twilight Zone. It sounds a little obsolete. And I know that there are companies out there now, you mentioned a few, but Zoe and Flori and Biome, I don't know if I'm pronouncing them correctly. So clearly you think that this has value. Do you think that most of us should go ahead and get tested just to see what we should be doing? I mean, maybe we're missing something.
I think
if we don't.
Yes. Yeah. So well, I guess I shouldn't overplay the personalized diet hand, right? So I think you're probably going to get 70% of the way there with a population scale intervention. Like if everybody ate a Mediterranean diet, we'd probably be pretty healthy as a population.
Okay. Yeah.
But you can do better than that through precision intervention. Some of these companies are selling ways of doing this. I think some of them have better science than others. There's definitely snake oil out there. I think a lot of this stuff is still a little bit not quite ready for prime time. I say if you want to get your microbiome sequenced, just as an exercise in curiosity and learning what bugs are there, that is what you should use these services for mostly at this point in time. When it comes to making sort of clinical decisions or health decisions, I think that maybe wait a few years until science catches up a bit to the claims.
That's great advice. So once again, common sense, right? Common sense really is the key. So let's move on to the interplay, the interaction between the gut microbiome and disease, specifically cancer. You talked about cancer before, and somebody asked how important is a diversified microbiome to increasing odds for surviving cancer? And also, what does your research say about the connection between a healthy, diversified, unique gut microbiome, which is what we want, and cancer treatment and the efficacy of the cancer treatment? What do you know about that?
Yeah, so many things one could say here. There's a lot of research in this area. Our neighboring institution, the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Institute, looks into this stuff a lot. Generally speaking, there's this process called inflammaging that happens, right?
Yes, I've written about it a great deal.
Right. Like systemic levels of inflammation do kind of creep up as we get older and older. And this is just a signature of aging generally. And the more you can reduce this, it seems the better it is for your health, right? You're less likely to get diabetes and so on and so forth. But one of the things that higher levels of systemic inflammation increases your risk for is cancer. And so to the extent to which you can leverage your microbiome through, say, the fermentation of dietary fibers by eating a lot of plants to produce more butyrate to reduce your inflammation over the long term, that probably has some sort of an effect on reducing your long-term risk of cancer. So good diet, good lifestyle, independent of your genetics, you can't really fix that. But good diet and good lifestyle can hedge some of your bets and improve your odds of not getting something like cancer. Now, that's sort of general, but there's many other aspects to this. So colorectal cancer, for example, is tied to an increased prevalence in bugs associated with your oral environment. So things like Fusobacterium or Streptococcus, a few other bugs that tend to be in the mouth. You see that they become more abundant in the gut, and they tend to colonize the environment around polyps and precancerous lesions in the intestinal epithelium. So that's a really interesting thing to investigate.
Question about that. So we know, is that genetic also, or is that not?
I think,
the proclivity for that.
No, not that particular phenomenon, I would say. The mechanism, in my mind, I have a sort of working mechanism. I don't know if this is true. It's sort of hypothesis. But we kind of know that the mucus layer in the human host side, that our mucus in our gut, it inhibits the formation of bacterial biofilms. Bacteria can form these sticky, sugary biofilms that allow them to attach to a surface. And our mucus actually turns off those genes in bacteria, so they can't form their own biofilms when our mucus is present. Now, the thing about a polyp, when you have a precancerous polyp that's coming out, it might be able to rise above this mucus layer somewhat and act as sort of a landing pad for some of these oral bugs that we're swallowing constantly. And normally they just go right through us and we poop them out. But maybe if there's a landing patch for them on these polyps, they'll stick and they can form a biofilm and persist. And that's where they can create metabolites that might be pro-cancerous and cause kinds of problems downstream. So that's sort of my working idea for how that's happening. But the genetic propensity is more on the side of, how likely are you to make a lot of polyps, right? Some people probably have a higher chance that their epithelium produces polyps than others. And so that is probably somewhat genetic. Mm-hmm. But I want to make one final point on the cancer side that's a little counterintuitive, right? So, context is always key in all of this. And one observation that's come out of cancer immunotherapy trials, right, where we leverage the immune system to kill the cancer, is that people who are more obese tend to do better in immunotherapy trials. They tend to have a leakier gut. They tend to have more inflammation. So their inflammation state is actually turned up. And normally that's not great for your health. But when you're fighting cancer with immunotherapy, it's good because your immune system's jacked up and ready to attack. And so when you take the reins off of your immune system with something like a PD-1 inhibitor therapy, the cancer is more able to come in and punch.
That's really incredible. That's incredible. So what do we take away from that information?
It's a complex system. And if you understand the system and all the levers and the collateral effects that are going to happen, you can engineer it. But it requires a really systemic scale understanding.
Mm-hmm. Let's now segue over to some more current research that you've done and you've just been talking about. In fact, I really enjoyed a YouTube video that you did recently explaining this. But a lot of people posted questions about statins and the relationship between statins, and which about 20% of Americans are on, as we understand it, and the health of the gut microbiome. They're very concerned, the people who posted these questions, about taking a statin for fear that it might create a negative environment in their guts. So they're worried about it. And those who are already on the statins are worried about it. So can you talk us through this? And what's the new research? What does it say?
Well, I first preface this by saying, statins are a huge boon to medicine, right? There are so many people who are not dead because statins exist. They radically have reduced the incidences of heart attacks in our population. And so if your cardiologist says you should take a statin, you should take a statin. I don't want to scare anybody away from that. In our study, we saw really very little evidence that statins have any kind of effect on the microbiome. They don't seem to impact the microbiome whatsoever. However, the microbiome seems to have an influence over how we respond to the statin. So this physiological response that we have to taking the drug seems to be modulated or mediated by the composition of the microbiome. And that's happening along different axes, both for the on-target effect of the statin. So statins inhibit an enzyme. It's the rate-limiting step in cholesterol synthesis, and that's how they're turning down cholesterol in the body, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so the composition of the microbiome is associated with how much the statin is able to turn down cholesterol synthesis. The on-target effect is seemingly mediated by the microbes. In addition to that, side effects are affected as well. So statins have a kind of mild to moderate impact on our metabolism in terms of insulin resistance and maybe progression towards diabetes. Mm-hmm. And so people who are taking statins progress in their diabetes or progress towards diabetes faster than they would otherwise. There's epidemiological evidence for this and a few other trials that show this kind of effect. It's not super strong, So, it's not like you're going to get diabetes if you take a statin, but it's an average effect that across the population leads to maybe 10% of people taking statins eventually transitioning into diabetes.
So would this make sense for people to have their microbiomes tested, as we were talking about before, by one of these companies to see if they're taking a statin? Would it make sense that so that have a better understanding of the effect that the statin is having, or I should say, the effect that their unique microbiome is having on the statin that they're taking? Is that important, do you think?
I think it might be important in the long run.
Because how do you know then? Like, how do you know how the interplay is happening to you as an individual?
I think, it's hard because in the United States currently, precision interventions when it comes to statins are not well accepted. There are already genetic markers that are known to affect the on-target effects of statins. And I think that there are some countries in Europe that already use sort of genetic testing to inform statin treatment. I think Switzerland, for example, does this. But in the US, it's sort of widely thought, you just give people as much as they can tolerate because, who cares about anything else? You want to reduce the effects of heart attacks, and any collateral effect is less important than a heart attack. So cardiologists just don't want to think about anything else. And it's harder to think about precision interventions. I think that we will get there eventually. I think that genetic testing and microbiome testing will allow us to get there. But there are not currently any companies that provide this service. Our paper is the first to sort of show this effect for both genome and microbiome. I should also preface that our study was observational. We're just looking at people that are in the wild, so to speak. They're just living their own lives, doing their own thing, and they just happen to be taking statins or not taking statins. And so whether or not these are causal associations or correlative, we still need to do some work to figure out. So we should do some clinical trials where we follow people over time, before and after starting a drug, monitor them, and try to see whether or not a precision intervention would do better than the standard of care that is currently given to people. And iLab is trying to work to build such a trial, but these things always take time and they're expensive. And so I don't know when it'll happen, but we're working towards it.
Because so many people were talking about statins, I just want to ask one more follow-up question on this before we move on. And that is, so would you recommend that people who are on statins to just maybe work in greater partnership with their healthcare provider to really take a careful look at how they're doing with possible progression towards diabetes? Is that a good recommendation?
Yes, I think
like
you should
keep an eye on it even more than most.
Totally. You should keep an eye on it. I think many people who are on statins will tell you that they had a period of time in which they worked closely with their doctor to find a tolerable dose or a tolerable type of statin. There are all kinds of side effects that you can get when you take statins. So myopathy or muscle pain is one.
Yes, my husband had that.
Messed up metabolism is another. So you should monitor these things and work with your clinician. Don't suffer in silence. Work with your doctor to find something that works for you. Maybe in the future, we'll have a way of predicting what will work for you before you had to suffer through the trial and error. But currently that doesn't exist. So you should just keep monitoring and work with your healthcare provider. There are also other things you can do with lifestyle to modulate your LDL levels. So you could, before getting into some drug treatment regime, you could try first some mild lifestyle interventions like changing your diet. There was a really cool clinical trial by a colleague of mine at Stanford, Justin Sonnenberg, where they showed that if you took a particular dietary fiber called arabinoxylan, which I believe is common in like rice bran, you could lower your LDL. So they saw people's LDL cholesterol go down. It was associated with a bacterial bile acid called ursodeoxycholate. And so that could be another lever to try to lower your LDL independent of a drug. But if that didn't work, then you should take your doctor's advice and just probably take the statin.
Yeah, I agree. I always like to get the message, lifestyle, food, exercise, etc. first, and medications if needed, of course.
Right.
We just have a few more, and people really want to know, what effect does the gut microbiome have on weight, on weight loss, weight gain, on weight?
A lot of research into this. One of the big preeminent studies of my field back in the early 2000s by Peter Turnbaugh showed that if you took microbiomes from obese humans and lean humans and you transplant them into mice, and then you feed those mice the exact same diet, the mice that got the transplant from the obese person got fat, and the mice that got the transplant from the lean person stayed lean. So that was sort of the first causal evidence in a mouse model, at least, that there was an association between weight loss and weight gain in the microbiome. It's been harder to show that kind of causality in humans. There's not quite as much research that sort of validates that work, but there are really interesting studies in the past few years. So there's a group in Denmark that have shown that people that are high in a particular microbe called Prevotella. This is an organism that tends to be associated with people living in the developing world or in indigenous cultures. It's like Bacteroides, but it's slightly different. It seems to inhabit the same niche. So you tend to either have Prevotella or Bacteroides. So people who are high in Prevotella, they lose weight pretty readily on a high fiber diet. But people who are high Bacteroides, they don't lose weight much on a high fiber diet. And so we see a sort of differential response between people on the same exact diet, depending upon their microbiome. And recently, our group actually did a study where we looked into the functional underpinnings of this kind of a responder-non-responder effect. So we did metagenomic sequencing all the genomes of all the bugs and all their genes in the poop, and looked at whether or not your baseline microbiome composition could predict whether or not you did or did not respond to a lifestyle intervention that allowed you to lose weight. And we saw an effect. So there were several genes in the microbiome that were associated with being able to lose weight or not. And just to give you one example, there was a signal for these genes called amylases. And these are enzymes that break down starch. We actually produce amylase in our saliva, and it helps us break down starch while we're chewing our food. But bacteria produce these amylases as well in the colon, and people who had higher levels of these bacterial amylases seem to have a harder time losing weight, which is to say that their bugs were perhaps allowing them to extract more calories from the fiber and the starch that was coming through than the people who had lower levels of these enzymes.
So again, is this a good example of someone who might be battling weight for his or her entire life? Should that person go and get the test to see what that level is to decide more fiber, less fiber, whatever path that person should be on? Because how else do you know?
it's I think, the hard part is like the science hasn't necessarily penetrated into the consumer or the clinical space as well. I think there probably are some of these companies that will tell you this information, right? They'll give you the citation for these papers that show that high Prevotella is associated with better capacity to lose weight on a high fiber diet. Ironically, having a high Prevotella microbiome also means that having a bad diet is worse. So people seem to have a worse response to a sort of westernized or American style diet when they're high Prevotella, but they have a better response to a healthy diet. So it's sort of like an effect amplifier in either direction, having a high Prevotella microbiome. But, this, I think, if you're a researcher, you can read the data and think about these things. But I think we're still catching up on the availability to the public side of things. Mm-hmm. So,
it's all so fascinating. But you're on the forefront. And, I'm going to keep coming back to you to find out what you're up to there in the Gibbons lab. And so you can give us a report on what's new. I just want to end this conversation with one more question about, you mentioned healthy lifestyle choices, like a Mediterranean-like diet and eating a lot of fruits and vegetables and the rainbow and, not eating meat so much and so on and so forth. Are there any other lifestyle choices that people can make that will have a positive effect on their gut microbiome? For example, keeping stress at bay, having a better night's sleep, more quality sleep, and so on. Do any of these other lifestyle habits affect one way or the other the microbiome?
Yeah, I mean, you pick any sort of lifestyle factor or health factor. And there's several papers that link the microbiome to it. Right? Whether that's correlation or causation is another thing. There's a lot of smoke in the microbiome field. And there's some fire, right? We've definitely found some really, truly clinical causal associations between disease and the microbiome that can be leveraged to make people better. But what can people be doing to stay healthy? It's the stuff that's pretty common sense, right? A good night's sleep does help you stay healthy. Eating a plant-based diet, largely plant-based diet, does help you stay healthy. Exercise. If you could do one thing, just exercise. That's probably the one single best intervention you can do for your health. It's been associated with the composition of the microbiome as well, but even independent of that, it's associated with so many other benefits in the body. So just do what's common sense, right? Try to live a healthy life. In the future, we're going to have more specific precision advice for people based on their genomes and their microbiomes. But the onus there is on the researchers still to prove that these types of precision personalized medicine models work well and compare them to what's already being done. I think that will happen, but it's not quite there yet.
You know, the analogy I like to use with this is sleep. I think for forever, everyone thought sleep, but it was nothing. We kind of just conk out and nothing happens. Nothing exciting happens. Well, we know that's not true now. Not at all. We know so much is going on when we're sleeping, which is why now sleep has become like the third pillar of overall health and wellness. And I really think that that's the case with all of this, that there's so much more to explore. And it's very exciting. And hey, listen, Dr. Gibbons, if I could do it all over again, I think I'd be heading in your direction. It's very, very exciting. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. This was a great conversation, super important for GRUFFtalk listeners, certainly important for me. Thank you. We need to have you come back because we did not get to all of the questions. I'm so sorry, everyone, if we didn't, but we will, I promise. I want to keep tabs on all the research that you and your team in the Gibbons lab at ISB are conducting about gut health. Really great. And everyone, I'll have links to some of the research in the show notes, and I'll try to get some of the spelling from Dr. Gibbons from some of the terms and companies that he shared with us today. And there'll be some bonus information included in the blog post on my website, barbarahannagrufferman.com. Dr. Gibbons, though, before I let you go, give us your 3 key giveaways. What do you want everyone? Because we covered so much and some of it was so dense, fascinating, and rich. But what are 3 things you'd like people to remember from our talk today?
Good question. First, you're not alone. We're not entirely human. We contain hundreds and hundreds of species that are part and parcel to the physiology and operation of our body. It's like a new organ of the human body. And we're just beginning to understand it, which is really, really exciting. That's the first takeaway. The second, the best thing you can do for your health, probably from a microbiome standpoint, is eat a diverse array of whole foods, fruits and vegetables, mostly plant-based diet. We've always kind of known that's true, but I guess we're kind of understanding why it's true now because of our understanding of the microbiome. And the final point I'll end with, takeaway, that I didn't talk about much earlier was you may not always want to turn back the clock when it comes to healthy aging. Right? What we're finding in the gut is that having an 80-year-old microbiome is actually good. You don't want a 20-year-old microbiome when you're 80. And so, some people are claiming you should do fecal transplants from 20-year-olds into old people to rejuvenate their microbiomes. Based on our work, we kind of think that that's not the case, that you should have a microbiome that's properly developing with you as you age. So I'll leave it at that. Those are my 3.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much. Really, thank you so much, Dr. Gibbons. Thank you for all the work that you and your team at the lab are doing. And I so appreciate your being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. And thanks to your listeners for all the great questions.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode of GRUFFtalk, please do 2 things. First, share it with all your friends and family, and subscribe to GRUFFtalk wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, so you never miss a single episode. Until next time, remember this: we can't control getting older, but we can control how we do it. Talk to you soon.